In the Invincible comics, there are 19 Viltrumites that we actually know the names of, and today we're explaining each one and giving them a rating out of 5. These ratings will be based on loyalty to the Viltrum Empire, job performance, strength, and in certain cases, the quality of their moustache. Okay, so the first person on this list is Nolan, who to me had the most interesting career of anyone in the Viltrum Empire. In issue 11, we got details about his backstory that weren't mentioned in the show. For example, when he was young, he initially didn't make the cut to be a soldier. Instead, he had a low-level job on the search committee, who are the ones that scan the universe looking for new planets to conquer. For 3 years, Nolan did this job while auditioning to be a soldier, and on the 3rd year, he did finally get accepted. His audition was so impressive that he got instantly sent to the front lines, where he led the charge against hundreds of different worlds. Pretty quickly, Nolan then rose through the ranks, being personally recognized with awards and leading his own division at a young age. Conquest said that back then, Nolan showed huge amounts of potential, with multiple characters in the present day referring to him as the Great Nolan. Over the centuries, stories of his heroics would even be told to kids, confirming that yeah, he's basically a living legend. However, when Viltrum got hit with the scourge virus, it wiped out 99.9% of their population. This forced the Empire to rethink their priorities, and so their new goal was to repopulate by finding a compatible species. Nolan's mission to Earth was part of that goal, and when he had Mark, he realized that humans were a good match. To be specific, hybrids between humans and Viltrumites have the same potential as full-blooded Viltrumites, making Earth the best planet to take over. That said, having spent 20 years living with humanity, Nolan had now fundamentally changed as a person. Back on Viltrum, everything he did was for the collective goal of expanding the Empire, but here he pretty much had free will and was able to, do things purely for the fun of it. In that time, he wrote books, had a family, worked as the hero Omni-Man, and gradually forgot about his mission. It was only when Mark got his powers that Nolan remembered why he was here, and his loyalty to Viltrum meant that he briefly tried to conquer the planet. Deep down though, the love he had for the Empire was gone, and after abandoning his mission, Nolan ended up in Viltrumite jail. This jail is where he became friends with Alan, who's the descendant of aliens he killed 1,000 years ago. Once they escaped, Omni-Man started working for the Coalition of Planets, which is a group dedicated to ending the Viltrum Empire. With knowledge of the Empire's weakness, Nolan helped to prepare the Coalition for war against the few remaining Viltrumites. During this war, he then personally destroyed the planet Viltrum along with his son, which in terms of loyalty, it can't really get any worse than that. Amazingly though, despite his betrayal, Nolan would go on to be made Emperor of the Viltrumites, after it was discovered that he's the son of a guy called Argall. Argall is someone who we'll explain later on, but for now, all we need to know is that he was the Emperor when the Empire was at its best. His whole life, Nolan had no idea this was his dad, and when the other Viltrumites found out, they made him their new leader. In that way, Nolan had gone from being an NPC to a legendary soldier, to a traitor, and then to an emperor, hence why, in my opinion, his career is the most interesting. Under his leadership, the Viltrumites fully integrated to life on Earth, and became a species that valued peace rather than the endless killing they used to do. Overall, Nolan gets a rating of 3.5 stars, with his job performance being his strongest asset. Although he did abandon the mission on Earth, we can't ignore how effective he was before that, and for such a long period of time. As Emperor, he also revolutionized the way Viltrumites live, and yeah, even though he made a big mistake early on, it's important to remember that he was kind of pushed into this role without any preparation. Now, someone who had a ton of preparation was Thragg, who was educated from birth to be the strongest Viltrumite. According to Nolan, Thragg was trained in various types of combat, which allowed him to become Grand Regent following the death of Argall. For context, Argall had a bunch of kids, but because Viltrum had made so many enemies, the identities of these children was kept a secret. As Grand Regent, Thragg's job was to find one of those kids and put them on the throne, and it's a job that he failed at terribly. His excuse for being so bad was that he assumed the scourge virus must have killed Argall's kids, but as we know, Nolan was one of the 50 surviving Viltrumites. If Thragg had simply tested the survivors, then Nolan would have taken charge decades ago, but instead he prioritized his own legacy and stopped looking for the rightful heir. This shows that Thragg's #1 loyalty was to himself rather than the Empire, and was proven further by the fact that he tried to kill the Graysons after finding out about their royal blood. Having said that, while he was Grand Regent, he still did some good things, like when he moved all the Viltrumites to Earth in an attempt to rebuild their population. There were also a few times when Thragg had a valid reason to kill someone, but for the good of the Empire chose to spare their life. Those type of situations showed us that Thragg does have the ability to think ahead, and in that sense he's better at the job than Nolan, who after becoming Emperor decided to release Thragg into the universe when he could have just kept him locked up if he really didn't want to kill him. At the time, Alan feared that giving Thragg freedom would allow him time to create his own army, but Emperor Nolan didn't think that was a threat. Of course, Thragg creating an army is exactly what happened, as he went on to make thousands of Thraxan Viltrumite hybrids. In his own words, he did this purely for revenge, because he refused to obey the bloodline that destroyed his home planet. During this revenge tour, we saw how overpowered Thragg really is, since he was able to just rip Invincible in half. To put this in perspective, imagine if someone showed up in season 1 and just casually split Nolan down the middle. This is the same thing, because by this point in the series, Mark and Omni-Man were on the same level. On top of that, we can't forget that way back in the chaos following Argall's death, Thragg had proven himself in battle to be the strongest Viltrumite. Since then, he defeated a bunch of the next strongest characters, including Dinosaurus, Thaedus, Oliver, Nolan multiple times, Mark multiple times, and Battle Beast, although that one could have gone either way. Even at the end of the series when he finally lost, Invincible wouldn't have survived this fight if he didn't have extensive outside help. For all these reasons, Thragg gets an initial rating of 4 stars, plus a bonus star for his moustache and amazing hairline. Next up, we have Terra Grayson, who's the daughter of Invincible and Atom Eve. From the beginning, Terra's life was basically pure chaos, as she was born on the same day that Robot took over the Earth. Following that, her parents chose to raise her on the alien planet of Telescria, where immediately Terra almost died. In particular, she had a bad reaction to some alien food, but after surviving this, things were normal for a short time. However, while she was still a baby, her dad went missing for 5 years. During that time, she fully adapted to life on Telescria, and it was only when Invincible returned that things went back to being crazy. For example, Terra was forced to watch as her mom, dad, and uncle got destroyed by Thragg and his 2 kids. I'd imagine this was probably the most traumatic thing she ever went through, but in the moment she did show massive amounts of bravery, similar to Oliver when he first got his powers. Now, in terms of Terra's performance, her work for the Empire began soon after Mark became Emperor. At the age of 8, she was directly involved in missions, as the Empire tried to help other planets in whatever way they could. By the time she was a teenager, Terra had then formed her own opinions about morality, which meant she didn't always see things the same way as Mark. For instance, on one mission, it's implied that a group of aliens were starving, and as a result of their hunger, they did something terrible, although we don't know what it was. In response, it seemed like Mark was going to punish them somehow, but Terra physically gets in the way, arguing that they deserve a second chance. This demonstrated her compassion, and years later she went to work for the Conservation Order. The Conservation Order is a part of the Viltrum Empire that goes from planet to planet, making sure that the tech they've installed is still working. In that sense, their job is to guarantee that people the Empire have helped continue to see the benefits. At an unknown point in the future, the coalition of planets goes to war with the Viltrumites, but Terra chooses not to fight, believing that her dad is the one responsible. On top of that, when the Conservation Order was thinking about leaving the Viltrum Empire, Terra strongly considered supporting them, which in terms of loyalty isn't the best thing. In the end though, it seems like that didn't happen, as she started working closer to the Emperor and was even his champion in a battle against another species. Based on the potential she showed here, Terra's rating works out to be 4 stars, and as a side note, the guy who trained her to fight is the next person on this list. General Kregg is someone who's been around since the Great Purge, aka the Civil War in Viltrum, meaning he's one of the 2 oldest Viltrumites by the end of the series. Under Thragg's leadership, Kregg was given the rank of General, and as far as we know, no one else had this title, making him the highest ranking officer. In this position, he did his best to make sure their numbers didn't drop, first by trying to give Nolan a second chance, and then by having a dozen kids with various human women. Although he hadn't been loyal to them, he was loyal to the Viltrum Empire, proven by how quickly he abandoned Thragg. For a bit of context, after the Graysons destroyed Viltrum, Kregg wanted both of them dead, but once he learned that Nolan was the prince, he didn't hesitate to follow him. This proved that unlike Thragg, Kregg's loyalty to the Empire was greater than his own personal feelings, and this worked out nicely for him since Nolan allowed him to have the family he wanted. Moving on, we have Conquest, who's a character so unstable that even the other Viltrumites don't like to be around him. For thousands of years, Conquest was used as a weapon by the Empire, and conquered every planet he was told to for nearly his entire life. This experience made him more sadistic than the average Viltrumite, as he found enjoyment in causing as much pain as humanly possible. However, in Invincible Season 3, we find out that although he is a weirdo, he's a weirdo with emotions. Due to his reputation, the other Viltrumites are scared of him, leading to a sense of loneliness that he just keeps to himself. From his point of view, he felt like he was capable of more than just conquering, but since the others just view him as an animal, he never gets the chance to do anything else. At the same time, he admits that his love of fighting is his main motivation, and unlike other soldiers who want to spread the Viltrum Empire, he only does this because killing is the one thing he enjoys. In the end, Conquest was defeated twice by Invincible after making big tactical mistakes, because the truth is, if he had locked in from the beginning, he could have won this easily. Partly due to that, he misses out on a perfect score, but gets a small bonus for confessing his feelings after what I assume is like 10,000 years. Emperor Argall is the 6th Viltrumite on this list, and is a person we know a lot about thanks to things said by everyone else. For instance, in issue 102, Thragg said that under Argall's leadership, Viltrum had become a paradise. For thousands of years, they were unopposed in the galaxy and expanded their empire to include countless different planets. According to Anissa, the Viltrumites all followed Argall because of his wisdom rather than his strength, which is something you'd never expect from a race that valued strength above pretty much everything else. On the flip side, Thaedus believed the Emperor was evil and assassinated him by shoving a bone into his skull. If we believe Thragg's version of history, then the death of Argall led to chaos for hundreds of years as the population fought themselves to find a new ruler. This ties into what Nolan said about Thragg being trained from birth, because he must have been born during this civil war. However, if we listen to Mark's version of history, it's clear that the civil war to find a new ruler is different from the civil war in which half the population was killed. According to Invincible, the first civil war is when Viltrumites got rid of the weak, allowing the empire to expand under Argall. Argall then continued to be in charge at least until the beginning of the scourge virus, and it was during that period of unrest that the emperor was murdered by Thaedus. Assuming that Mark's version of history is correct, then Argall was in charge for both the highest and one of the lowest points of the Viltrum Empire, and was so respected that people were willing to follow his traitor son. Therefore, the former emperor gets a 5 out of 5 for job performance and loyalty, but I didn't include a rating for strength since there's just no way to be accurate. Now, switching over to Argall's first grandson, we have Mark Grayson, aka Invincible. In case you haven't seen it, I did make a video explaining Mark's entire life, so for today our only focus is to calculate his rating. Starting off with his loyalty and performance, Mark's first mission was to conquer Earth on behalf of the Viltrum Empire. This was a mission he rejected not once, not twice, not even 3 times, but on 4 separate occasions, because in his words, he didn't give a shit about Viltrum. Despite this terrible start, when we examine Mark's time as Emperor, his rating drastically goes up. For instance, he transformed the Viltrumites from a species that was purely based on Earth to one that brought peace to thousands of alien worlds across the universe. As stated by Alan, Mark ended wars in places that had been fighting for generations and shut down any threats to the galaxy. His empire also provided renewable energy, helped aliens to escape their dying solar systems, and made sure that people they'd helped in the past didn't get forgotten. Mark was so effective at this that the coalition of planets was no longer needed, which led to Alan starting a war with Viltrum to protect his own interests. This is what brings us to Mark's strength, because by the end of this series, it seems like he was physically stronger than Alan, who himself was even stronger now than he was when he beat Omni-Man to a pulp. To put this another way, Alan is way stronger than Nolan ever was, and in a fight between him and Invincible, Mark gave him a physical and ideological beatdown. For that reason, his strength and job performance gets a perfect score, but he takes a hit for his extreme disloyalty in the early days, although in his defense it's not as bad as Nolan, since Mark was never raised as a Viltrumite. Viltrumite number 8 is Anissa, who's the person that was arguably changed the most by living on Earth. For context, when Thragg brought them to this planet, we saw that General Kregg and others began developing attachments towards humans. Despite that, Anissa was the most stubborn and shared Thragg's opinion that humans were just animals. In fact, out of all the known Viltrumites, she was the most resistant to mating with humans, hence why she turned her attention to Mark. In the words of Nolan, Viltrumite DNA is so pure that Mark is basically full-blooded, not to mention he also has the blood of Argall. As a result, Anissa developed an interest in Invincible, and throughout the story she kept touching him and just making passes at him. Of course, by far the worst incident is when she milked him against his will, which led to the creation of their son, who we'll talk about later. For now, the point is that Anissa refused to integrate like the rest of her people, and still did things the way they were done on Viltrum. That said, 5 years later she became a completely different person, and was married to a human called Scott. In issue 63, it was revealed that true Viltrumites never form these kind of emotional bonds, but by this point she'd actually become a normal, good person. One example is how she agreed to protect Earth without any hesitation, even though Nolan made it clear she didn't have to. Then, when the battle against Thragg happened, Anissa sacrificed herself to save Eve because she was thinking about what Eve's death would do to Mark. It's fair to say that Anissa's selflessness in this moment had a massive impact that ultimately helped them to win the war. When you combine that with her undeniable loyalty to Viltrum, her rating works out to exactly 4 stars. Anissa's 2 kids are up next, and starting off with Markus, this is the son she had with Invincible. Markus, aka Marky, was left behind on Earth when the Viltrumites began their expansion to the rest of the universe. In Mark's defense here, he's not a deadbeat, he did actually want to take his son, but with Anissa being dead, it made sense that Marky would stay on Earth with the guy that actually raised him. As he grew up, Marky had a close relationship with Debbie and idolized both his dad and his granddad. At a young age, he started fighting crime as the new Invincible and would occasionally be visited by Mark and also Terra. From Terra's point of view, she had no love for him, even going as far as to say he's not her brother, but admittedly this is when they were super young. From Marky's perspective, he didn't say anything as crazy as what she said, but he was jealous of the fact that she got to be with Mark all the time. As the Viltrum Empire then became more and more successful, Markus said that he worked hard to live up to his dad's legacy. In particular, he did amazing things for Earth and other nearby planets, and according to Mark, Marky had surpassed him in a lot of different ways. Regardless, when Markus found out how he was made, he began to hate himself and assumed that his dad hated him too. In the future, this led to him angrily attacking the Emperor, and according to Marky himself, he had the power to kill his dad. Obviously, this might not be the truth, he could be lying or underestimating how powerful Mark really is, but when we consider that he has royal blood and Anissa's genes on top, it makes sense that he would have that kind of potential. That's why I'm going to be generous and believe him, which means Markus gets a 5 out of 5 rating for strength, but his attempt to kill the Emperor did bad things for his loyalty. Following Marky, we have his other sister, who was a baby when she was first introduced. Molly is the child that Anissa had with Scott, and is one of the many human Viltrumite hybrids. When Mark left Earth, he thought it might be useful for the planet to have 2 Viltrumites, but by the final time we see her, she still doesn't have powers. To be fair, Invincible also didn't have powers at this age, so there is still time, but unless the TV show expands on this in the final episode, then yeah, Molly will forever be quirkless. Anyhow, Viltrumite number 11 is Thaedus, who's arguably the most impactful character. If it wasn't for his betrayal, then Argall would still be alive, the scourge virus never would have happened, Nolan wouldn't have had to mate with a human, and Mark never would have existed. Thaedus was the first Viltrumite to rebel against the Empire, and by founding the Coalition of Planets, he created a meaningful resistance. As leader of the Coalition, his tactics were usually super aggressive, as it was his DNA that was used to manufacture the scourge virus. This makes Thaedus responsible for the death of nearly their entire race, not to mention he personally killed the Emperor. As if that wasn't enough, after winning the Viltrumite War, it was Thaedus' idea to blow up his home planet, which as we know he did with the help of Mark and Nolan. To put this in perspective, he killed the Emperor that all Viltrumites love, wiped out 99.9% of their population, and destroyed their home planet. So, as far as Viltrumites go, it doesn't really get much worse than this guy. As head of the Coalition, Thaedus gets a perfect rating, as he did everything in his power to end the Viltrum Empire, and he even left a good backup plan in case of his death. As a Viltrumite though, he gets 1 out of 5 stars, with his only redeeming quality being his strength. Now, the next 2 characters are a pair of twins, which for Viltrumites is something that almost never happens. For context, earlier we mentioned how Thragg made an army of Thraxan Viltrumite hybrids, and the reason he did this is because, as we know, Thraxans grow up super quickly. In this way, his army was able to outnumber the real Viltrum Empire in only 5 years, but Thragg knew his hybrids would never be as strong as the real thing. That's why he described all of his children as disposable, however he did value the twins slightly more than the others. Onaan was a psycho who liked to torture his victims, and even had a special cave where he enjoyed making people suffer. Physically speaking, we can assume he was stronger than most Thraxan hybrids, because otherwise there's just no way his dad would have trusted him the way that he did. Along with his sister, Onaan was sent by Thragg to kill the Graysons, but ended up dying when Invincible crushed his neck with one hand. Yeah, I'm sorry, that is the Thraxan part of his DNA. After his death, the only person who genuinely cared was Ursaal, who was the most compassionate out of Thragg's children. Unlike her dad, Ursaal valued the lives of all of her siblings, and hated the way that he used them as disposable human shields. Then, in the final battle against Nolan and the Coalition, Ursaal saw how Anissa, Alan, and Mark showed compassion and actually cared when their allies were in danger. This is a feeling she'd never experienced, and it's ultimately what caused her to abandon her father's side. After convincing her siblings to surrender, the Thraxan hybrids were welcomed to Invincible's Viltrum Empire. Their arrival boosted the size of his army by thousands, which made it easier to expand into the galaxy the way that they did. Centuries later, Ursaal is seen fighting in Mark's war with the Coalition, and from her conversation with Terra, I got the impression that she's more loyal to the Empire than his own kids. That's why overall she gets 4.5 stars, with her most important contribution being how she transformed the Empire from a few dozen people into thousands of Viltrumites. Oliver Grayson is the next Thraxan hybrid. In fact, he's the original, and his main allegiance was to the Coalition of Planets. For most of his life, Oliver lived on Telescria, where the Coalition is based, and supported Alan in his goal to end the Viltrum Empire. For context, Oliver's Thraxan DNA allows him to remember every moment of his life, and since he was a baby, soldiers from the Empire had tried to kill him. That's partly why he felt no allegiance to them, and was so desperate to finish them that he nearly released the Scourge virus on Earth. In that sense, Oliver hated Viltrumites even more than Mark and Nolan, because he was willing to sacrifice the human race just so around 40 Viltrumites would also die. Following that failed attempt, he went back to Telescria, where he spent pretty much the rest of his life. When Nolan became Emperor and just let Thragg go, Oliver worked with the Coalition to track him down and even became a double agent, so for a while he was working for Thragg, but only as a way to get closer to him and to get information. This showed his dedication to ending the threat of evil Viltrumites, but he had no problem with the Empire itself as an institution once his dad was in charge. When Oliver was then killed by Thragg, his death is what inspired Mark to come out of retirement, and without this, it's possible Thragg never would have been defeated. Therefore, as an agent of the Coalition, Oliver gets a perfect score for his loyalty, his performance, and ultimately his sacrifice. As a side note, he had a pair of twins with his wife, which implies that twins might be a common thing for Thraxans. Anyhow, one of the oldest Viltrumites in history is Thula, who was alive during the Great Purge. Her design is one of the most memorable thanks to the dagger woven into her hair, but despite thousands of years worth of experience, Mark almost beat her when he was still a teenager. At this stage of his life, Invincible was objectively weak for a Viltrumite and didn't stand a chance against soldiers like Nolan or Anissa. When it comes to Thula though, he was able to toss her around when he stopped holding back, and if he didn't hesitate, he could have actually killed her. Later in the comics, Thula fully integrates to life on Earth under Emperor Nolan and has a couple of kids with this unknown man. Then, when Mark takes over as Emperor, she follows him as the Empire expands out into the universe. Along with General Kregg, she's the only known Viltrumite to serve under Argall, Thragg, Nolan, and Invincible, and was seen in the final chapter fighting against the Coalition. In the show, someone who Thula worked closely with was Lucan, who's another person that made it to the end of the series. During season 2, Lucan was disgusted by Oliver's existence, and viewed a Thraxan Viltrumite hybrid as being unnatural. That said, he was more than happy for a human Viltrumite hybrid to join the Empire, if Mark managed to prove his strength. In the comics, Lucan had aspirations to rise through the ranks of the Viltrum Empire, but admitted that he does sometimes lose focus during fights. Then, when Thragg moved the Viltrumites to Earth, Lucan was one of the first ones to kind of go off script because he refused to cheat on his human girlfriend by mating with more than one person. 5 years later, he and his wife had 2 kids with a third on the way, and the eldest of those children was Kalmon. I'm assuming that it's pronounced Kalmon because it's just spelled like salmon with a K. But anyway, Kalmon was a hybrid who got his powers at around 5 years old and used them at school to fight back against a bully. This got him in trouble with Lucan, who wanted them to blend in and, just act like normal humans, and so Kalmon agreed that next time he'd allow the bully to just keep punching him. In chapter 137, Kalmon and his sister Alicia were kidnapped by a robot and then taken to the GDA. Under the Pentagon, they were kept as hostages alongside Marky and the other Viltrumite hybrids, but Kalmon tried to break them out. Unfortunately, because he was just so young, Robot easily overpowered him, and the kids were all stuck here until they got rescued by the Empire. Hundreds of years later, we see Lucan fighting against the Coalition, and this guy near to him might be a grown-up Kalmon, but in theory this could also be Kalmon's great-great-great-grandson. Like, we honestly have no idea, just because so much time has passed. Lastly, the 19th Viltrumite on this list is Vidor, who killed a ton of Thraxans during the battle on their planet. Vidor believed that if someone is weak enough to be killed, then they never deserve to live in the first place, which is kind of ironic considering what happened to him. He also seemed to think that he could take Nolan in a fight, even though Nolan beat him while at the same time fighting Thula as well. Like, Nolan was handling multiple things at the same time, this wasn't even his main focus, and Vidor still got destroyed. I will say, Vidor had one of my favorite Viltrumite designs, not just because of the glasses, but because he's the only Viltrumite I can think of whose moustache is a radically different color. With that said, that was every named Viltrumite in this series so far. Maybe we'll get to see some more in the future if the show creates some new ones, but for now, this is everyone. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe as we are so close to 500k, like, it is literally so close. I think if everyone who watches this video subscribes, we're gonna hit it for sure. We are definitely gonna get there. So yeah, I'd really appreciate it. And until the next one, peace out.